I swear, the air in Whispering Pines Estate smells permanently like freshly cut grass and passive-aggressive ambition. This isn't a neighborhood. It's a meticulously manicured outdoor museum dedicated to the concept of keeping up with the Joneses. The lawns here are measured in millimeters, and the anxiety, mine mostly, is palpable. My neighbors, bless their hearts, treat their yards like high-stakes performance art. I mean, Mrs. Henderson uses tweezers to plant her petunias. Tweezers? Me? I'm Jake, mid-30s, and I work from home, which means my biggest daily conflict is deciding if I should put on pants or just stay in my glorified pajamas. My creative job, I freelance design and write corporate nonsense, gives me enough mental stimulation. I don't need my front yard to be a source of stress. So, last summer, I decided to go rogue. Not full anarchy, just environmentally responsible. I ripped out the thirsty, useless sod, brought in some nice river rock, and planted a selection of drought-resistant native flora. Think sagebrush, purple coneflower, and some spiky little succulents. It looked rugged, textural, and honestly a lot cooler than 50 shades of synthetic green. It was glorious. It was also, apparently, an international incident. It was a Tuesday, mail day. I was enjoying a perfectly brewed cup of coffee and contemplating the moral implications of eating a second bagel when I saw the envelope. Heavy, cream-colored stock, embossed with a seal that looked suspiciously like two hedge clippers crossed swords. It was from the Whispering Pines Beautification Committee, WPBC, which is just the HOA's way of sounding like they run an actual government. I opened it with a groan. My eyes immediately went to the bold text. Violation Notice, Case 24-198B. Charge: Unnatural and aesthetically disharmonious flora arrangement. Unnatural? I nearly choked on my coffee. These plants literally grew here before the developers bulldozed the place and installed the mandatory decorative lamp posts. I read the detailed description. It cited my yard for deviating from the established visual symmetry of the community. And the kicker: the inclusion of coarse, unpolished stone and untamed native species constitutes an immediate threat to suburban serenity. A threat? My tiny sagebrush was threatening the peace? It was the most absurd thing I had ever read. The initial fine, $500. My first thought was a full-blown righteous fury. I slammed the letter down, the coffee sloshing slightly. This wasn't about aesthetics. It was about control. It was about Dolores Finch. Ms. Dolores Finch, the committee chair. She lives 2 doors down, maintains a lawn so pristine it probably has its own separate tax ID, and carries herself with the severe moral superiority of a woman who has never once forgotten to return a library book. She had been giving my rock heap the kind of withering side-eye usually reserved for flat earthers. I debated, ignoring it, but $500 is $500. I decided to call the main contact number, which routed straight to Dolores's personal, ridiculously formal voicemail. I figured a little sarcasm couldn't hurt. Beep. Hello, Ms. Finch. This is Jake Harrison at 1422 Birchwood. I'm calling regarding violation 24198B. I just want to express my profound appreciation for your diligence in identifying my unnatural and aesthetically disharmonious flora arrangement. As a dedicated environmentalist, I believe in returning to the natural state of things, and I can assure you, the moment I figure out what natural means to the WPBC and get a written definition, I will rectify the situation immediately. Until then, please accept my apologies for the unsettling view. You want natural, Dolores? Fine. We'll talk about natural. I hung up, feeling slightly better, but the fight was on. This wasn't just a fine now, it was a crusade. If they wanted my native plants gone, they'd get what they asked for, but they sure wouldn't get a perfect green carpet. The question was, what was the most aggressively compliant thing I could possibly do? I'd hoped the voicemail would result in a callback, maybe a civil conversation, perhaps a small, begrudging compromise. What I got instead was a formal memo, delivered by hand, by Dolores's husband, Gary, who looked genuinely terrified, stating that my appeal would be heard at the next monthly meeting of the WPBC. Reluctantly, I cleaned up, threw on a polo shirt — I figured a suit would make me look too desperate — and drove the 3 blocks to the community center. The setting was pure corporate suburbia, brightly lit. Beige walls, and 3 tables arranged in a stiff U-shape. At the center sat the committee, radiating palpable disappointment in the world. Dolores Finch was the undeniable centerpiece. Sharp blazer, hair shellacked into an impenetrable helmet, and that permanent scowl that made her look like she was smelling week-old milk. To her right was Gary, the nervous note-taker, who kept offering me weak, panicked smiles. To her left was Mr. Peterson, an older gentleman who 5 minutes into the meeting was already fighting a losing battle with gravity and was quietly snoring. "Mr. Harrison," Dolores began, her voice a precise, nasal monotone, "please state your grounds for appeal regarding the condition of your property." I pushed my paperwork across the table. "Good evening, committee. My appeal is simple. The violation is for unnatural flora arrangement. My garden consists of plants native to this exact location. Therefore, by any objective definition of the word, it is the most natural arrangement possible. Furthermore, I cite the community's own Green Living pamphlet, which encourages drought-resistant landscaping." Dolores merely blinked, slow and deliberate, like a lizard evaluating prey. "Mr. Harrison, your argument is overly literal. The spirit of Article 4, Section B, Subclause 12 clearly mandates suburban serenity, a look your—" she paused, visibly cringing, "weeds fail to provide." "Weeds, Ms. Finch? That's common sagebrush, a keystone species. It attracts local pollinators. Are we finding bees now?" I tried to keep the tone light, but the passive aggression was thick enough to chew. "The WPBC does not concern itself with migratory fauna," she sniffed, adjusting her blazer. "It concerns itself with visual continuity. Your yard is an anomaly. The regulations prioritize a low-variance, harmonious aesthetic. Your assortment of jagged stone and desiccated-looking brush introduces an element of visual distress." I leaned forward, trying to reason with the unreasoning. "Visual distress? Are you saying seeing a plant that isn't bright green gives you anxiety? That's a personal issue, not a compliance issue. My plants are healthy, they conserve water, and they're environmentally sound." "And yet," Gary chimed in meekly, pointing at a laminated photo of my yard, "they don't match the neighborhood standard." "There is no standard listed in the document. You have vague terms like serenity and continuity. Define continuity. Does it mean uniformity? Because if so, why not just pave the whole thing over? That's certainly uniform." I was half joking, half venting. Little did Dolores know I was giving her a preview of the apocalypse. Dolores pounced. "Mr. Harrison, we have deemed your current installation non-compliant. While we commend your zeal for, certain flora, the appearance is simply too divergent. We uphold the initial $500 penalty." My jaw tightened. "And the compliance timeline? You have 30 days to rectify the situation and replace the area with approved ground cover, such as turf, approved mulch, or an acceptable decorative stone aggregate, before daily penalties of $50 commence. I gathered my papers. My hands were trembling slightly, not from fear, but from the sheer, burning injustice of it all. Thank you for your time, committee. You've been illuminating. As I walked out, I muttered a loud, theatrical, internal dialogue. Suburban serenity? She looks like she uses pure anxiety as a facial toner. They uphold the fine because my plants don't look like everyone else's? They want uniformity. They want something inert? Something that won't attract visual distress? Fine. They've pushed the wrong guy. I got into my car and sat there for a good 5 minutes, staring at the manicured hellscape of whispering pines. I realized I couldn't win by citing science or law. I had to win by playing by their rules, only taking their rules to their logical, ridiculous extreme. I pulled out the UPBC rulebook again. The key phrases kept jumping out. Approved ground cover and must not introduce an unnatural element. I closed the book with a snap. They want inert? They want uniform? They want something that conserves water and is technically natural, but functionally useless. A huge, mischievous grin spread across my face. I knew exactly what I needed. The drive home was less a commute and more a descent into glorious, spite-fueled madness. I felt like a cartoon villain who'd just discovered the plans for the Death Star. I had 30 days, $500 less in my checking account, and a burning desire to create the most aggressively compliant, yet spiritually devastating, yard in the history of suburban compliance. The first step was the brain dump. I made a huge, terrible list on my whiteboard. Option A, turf. Too easy, too green, too much work. No. Option B, crushed stone/pebbles. Acceptable, but boring. Still visually textured, Dolores wins on aesthetics. Option C, pave it. Too expensive, probably needs a permit. Low variance, though. Option D, sand. Sand. The word sat there, stark and beautiful. I grabbed my laptop and plunged into the murky depths of the WPBC bylaws again. I wasn't looking for a compromise. I was looking for a technicality. Rule 4B12B. Approved ground cover materials include decorative aggregates, non-organic mulches, and permeable surfaces. Wait a minute. What is sand? It's a decorative aggregate. It's a non-organic mulch. It's definitely permeable. It's literally the most natural material on the planet, formed by millennia of erosion. It's sand. And the color. It couldn't just be boring brown sand. It had to be a statement. It had to hurt. My eyes landed on a photo of a high-end pool supply website I'd accidentally clicked. They were selling pure, pristine, white silica filter sand. Blindingly white. Zero texture, zero color, 100% uniform. It's inert, visually uniform, and if I put enough of it down, it would be the most boring, most compliant, and most aggressively minimalist yard on the planet. It was my anti-garden, the perfect, dazzling white space where joy and flora went to die. The epiphany. I realized the rules didn't mandate plants. They just mandated a visually uniform and acceptable decorative aggregate that wasn't unnatural. Sand is the ultimate natural aggregate. The irony was so thick I could spread it on my bagel. I did a quick measurement of my front yard, about 800 square feet. A quick calculation on a bulk materials website told me that for a 6-inch depth, I would need exactly 10 tons of the stuff. 10,000 pounds of fine white powder, ready to turn my front yard into a desert moonscape. My conspiratorial fervor reached peak level. I immediately called my best friend, Chloe, who lives in an apartment downtown and thinks gardening means buying a new desk cactus. Chloe, you're not going to believe what Dolores did. Did she demand you re-grout your driveway again? Chloe asked. Worse. They fined me $500 for unnatural flora, for my native plants. They want me to replace my yard with acceptable ground cover. I heard her sip her drink. Okay. So what are you doing? Getting turf? No. I'm buying 10,000 pounds of pure white silica sand. There was a long silence, followed by a startled cough. Wait, Jake, you're going to turn your front yard into a giant litter box just to spite a woman named Dolores? It's not a litter box. It's a zero-maintenance, hyper-minimalist desert biome. And yes, mostly to spite Dolores. Legally, I can't violate the code because sand is a decorative aggregate. But visually, it will be the biggest violation of suburban serenity the world has ever seen. Jake, Chloe said, a note of awe creeping into her voice. That is the single most beautiful act of passive aggression I've ever heard of. But where do you find a guy who will dump 10 tons of beach on your house? Exactly. I need a contractor who doesn't ask questions, the kind of person who sees a 5-figure check and just nods and gets out the heavy machinery. My search for contractors began. It would not be easy. My initial searches were deeply unsatisfying. I tried calling aesthetically pleasing landscaping, the green dream, and lush life landscaping. They all sounded like they specialized in imported Italian olive trees and mandatory neighborhood approval, but I had to start somewhere. I chose the most professional-sounding company, Lush Life, and booked a consultation. The contractor, Ted, arrived promptly at 9:00 a.m. on a Thursday. Ted was the physical embodiment of a $10,000 landscaping budget. Crisp polo shirt, expensive sunglasses perched on his perfectly styled hair, and he drove a pristine Ford F-150 that had probably never seen actual dirt. I met him in the driveway. Welcome, Ted. Thanks for coming. My pleasure, Jake, Ted said, pulling a tiny, polished notepad from his pocket. He surveyed my current yard, the now condemned native rock garden, with the pitying look of a doctor examining a third-world infection. Well, we can see the potential here. I assume you're looking for a full restoration. The rock work is challenging. Challenging is one word for it, I agreed. The neighborhood association deemed it unnatural and aesthetically disharmonious, so it all has to go. Ted brightened. Ah, the WPBC. They have excellent taste. We're one of their preferred vendors. So we'll restore the turf here. Maybe some hydrangeas. Perhaps a small water feature to mask the road noise. We could do a lovely little Bermuda grass that uses 40% less water than fescue. No, Ted. No turf. No plants. No hydrangeas. Not even plastic ones. He tilted his head, his smile slipping a notch. Pardon me? I led him onto the doomed patch of dirt. Actually, Ted, I need you to remove everything. Down to the soil. I want every single rock, root, and piece of organic matter scooped out. Then I need you to install a heavy-duty commercial-grade weed barrier, the kind that costs more than my car, bordered by polished aluminum edging that meets the PBC's exact specifications. Ted was scribbling, his brow furrowed. Okay, total clear, industrial liner. For what exactly? A stone patio? A custom deck base? I took a deep breath. This was the moment. No. I need you to fill the entire 800 square feet with 10 tons of pool filter-grade white silica sand. The silence was profound. Ted stopped scribbling. His pen hovered exactly 3 inches above his notepad. He slowly took off his sunglasses, revealing eyes that were, for the first time, completely naked and confused. I'm sorry, Mr. Harrison. Did you say sand? Like beach sand? White silica sand. The fine, uniform, blindingly white kind. 10 tons. Spread evenly, 6 inches deep, completely covering the front yard. Ted stared at me as if I had just asked him to landscape Mars. Sir, we don't do that. Are you building a sandcastle monument? A professional volleyball court? Because that requires specific drainage permits and netting. Nope, it's ground cover. Uniform, inert, non-flora ground cover. It's an acceptable decorative aggregate, Ted. I checked the bylaws. It meets all the requirements. He attempted to pivot, the professional smile snapping back into place, albeit shakily. Sir, crushed stone is beautiful. It comes in a lovely Tuscan blend. It gives texture. It has color. Sand tends to blow away. And frankly, it looks like a beach, which, unless you're 2 miles from the ocean, is, well, unnatural for this elevation. Unnatural is what got me fined in the first place, Ted. I'm going for aggressively uniform and technically compliant. The sand stays. The only question is, can Lush Life Landscaping handle a job that involves zero life? Ted avoided eye contact, staring at a perfectly manicured privet hedge down the street. He spent a solid 30 seconds fiddling with his pen, clearly running the numbers in his head. He wasn't calculating the labor, he was calculating the potential damage to his company's reputation. Mr. Harrison, he finally said, his voice dropping to a serious, almost desperate whisper. This is a statement. And as artists, we respect statements. But this type of specialized, non-conventional project requires extensive logistical planning, specialized hauling, and high-impact material sourcing. 10 tons is a massive amount of silica. He then proceeded to quote me a price that was frankly insulting. It was about triple what the entire project should have cost. We're looking at $25,000, Mr. Harrison. Minimum. We have to account for the conceptual labor, you see. My internal reaction was swift and fiery. He just added a 0, the greedy jerk. He thinks I'm a lunatic artist and he's trying to price me out. $25,000 for a giant sand box? $25,000, Ted? I kept my voice level. You're charging a premium for the fact that you think this is weird, aren't you? I'm charging for the unique vision and the risk to our established suburban portfolio, he insisted, his eyes glazing over with fake seriousness. I see. Well, Ted, I appreciate your honesty. It seems you need someone with a greater appreciation for abstract minimalism and petty bureaucracy. I'm looking for a vendor who is more focused on the delivery of the material and less on the artistic implications of the statement. I think we'll go a different route. Ted looked relieved, tucked his notepad away, and practically sprinted back to his pristine truck. As he sped off, I realized I needed to forget the polished prose. I needed someone who handled dirt and volume, someone who didn't care about suburban serenity or portfolio risk. I needed a fixer. My search shifted from landscaping aesthetics to bulk material hauling and excavation. I started finding ads in the classifieds, the ones with slightly grainy logos and phone numbers scribbled in Sharpie. That's how I found Mitch. Mitch's business was called Mitch's Dirt and Debris. You dig it, we haul it. You need it, we drop it. His business card was crumpled. His logo looked like it was designed in Microsoft Word in 1998, and his main truck, which I saw when he rolled up to my house for the quote, was audibly rattling. Perfect. Mitch was a man of few words and vast experience with heavy machinery. He looked like he hadn't slept in a week, but he was direct and pragmatic. So, "What's the job?" Mitch asked, chewing on a toothpick, his eyes scanning the yard with the detached air of a man calculating tonnage, not texture. I laid it out for him, skipping the WPBC drama. "Full clear-out, everything removed, down to the dirt. Then install heavy fabric liner, and I need 10 tons of specialty white silica sand delivered and spread 6 inches deep across this entire area." Mitch stopped chewing the toothpick. He tilted his head, regarding the native plants one last time. 10 tons of sand? That's a lot of sand, man. You building a volleyball court? Nope, ground cover. He stared at the ground, then at me, then back at the ground. He shrugged. Whatever, not my problem. Pool filter sand is easy to source in bulk. It's clean. Full clear out and prep is a 2-day job. Cash, no questions asked, I'm in. Sounds like a statement. I smiled. It absolutely is a statement, Mitch. The negotiation was simple. Mitch quoted a quarter of Ted's price, and the only terms he had were that I had to supply the white silica and pay him in 2 installments, half up front, half when the sand was level. I insisted on a simple contract, mostly for my own peace of mind. I pulled out a standard freelance agreement form. I just need you to sign this, Mitch. It explicitly states the job is full removal of existing flora and rock, installation of commercial-grade weed barrier, and installation of white silica sand ground cover. Mitch looked at the paperwork like it was an alien manuscript, then pulled out a napkin and a red crayon. We can do this. Just sign here. Jake, this says I do the thing you want, and you give me the money. We good? I signed his napkin with a flourish. This was the most legally binding, yet informal contract of my life. I paid the first half in crisp hundreds. The next day, the Great Plant Massacre began. Mitch's team, 2 guys who looked like they were serving community service and 1 tiny bobcat loader, rolled up early. The noise was incredible. The bobcat was merciless, scraping the earth, tearing out roots, and piling up my beautiful, now condemned native species into a massive mound of unnatural debris. The neighborhood reaction was immediate. Mr. Periwinkle, the retired accountant from across the street, emerged from his house, looking like he was witnessing a war crime. He approached the aluminum boundary, shielding his eyes from the dust. "Good heavens, Jake! What are you doing? They're slaughtering the black-eyed Susans!" He spoke with the grief of a man who had just seen his favorite golf club snapped in half. I walked over, pulling down my dust mask. "We're replacing them, Mr. Periwinkle. The WPBC found my former arrangement aesthetically disharmonious. I'm now installing a more legally compliant inert surface. Think of it as a sustainable lunar module landing pad." "A landing pad?" he squeaked. "Minimalism, sir. 0 maintenance, 0 water, 0 complaints, technically." He shook his head sadly and retreated. He clearly thought I'd lost my mind, but he also clearly didn't want to get involved with the WPBC, so he just backed away. The first day was pure demolition. The second day was the installation of the heavy black weed barrier, which made the yard look like a freshly paved, rectangular hole in the earth. It was dark, uniform, and utterly depressing. Then, on the third day, the sand arrived. Mitch's dump truck was immense. It was a beast of rusty metal, pulling a payload that felt biblical. It backed up to my driveway, the engine roaring a challenge to the entire neighborhood. And then, slowly, majestically, the 10 tons of white silica sand began to pour out. It wasn't just white. It was dazzling. It looked like powdered sugar, or maybe a very expensive pile of cocaine. It was so fine and uniform that it had a sheen in the morning light. The sheer volume of it was overwhelming. The massive pile dominated my front yard, looking completely, beautifully, and aggressively out of place. Mitch's crew, armed with shovels and rakes, set about spreading the 10 tons across the yard. It took hours of back-breaking work, but slowly, the black liner disappeared, replaced by a perfectly level 6-inch blanket of blinding white. The aluminum edging provided a sharp, geometric frame. When they were done, I paid Mitch the rest of the cash. He didn't thank me, he just nodded, climbed into his rattling truck, and left, the toothpick still firmly planted in his mouth. I stood there, staring at my new yard. It was magnificent. It was uniform. It was inert. It was visually disturbing. It looked like a giant Zen garden that had been abandoned halfway through the Enlightenment process, and it was all perfectly, perfectly legal. I woke up the next morning and hurried to the window. I pulled back the curtain, expecting to see a miracle, and was instead assaulted by a flash of light. The front yard, bathed in the early morning sun, was a stunning, blinding white expanse. It looked like a giant, sun-drenched minimalist statement piece, or where Godzilla would take a summer vacation. The contrast between my neighbor's impossibly green lawns and my perfect white desert was jarring, hostile, and utterly glorious. I grinned. This was my suburban serenity. I made a coffee and sat on my porch just to watch the show. The neighborhood reactions were immediate. First, the joggers. They'd slow down, turn their heads in slow motion, sometimes tripping slightly over the curb as they took in the dazzling spectacle. I heard one guy, mid-gasp, cut off his podcast to mutter, "What the hell?" Then came the dog walkers. They'd often stop their dogs abruptly. The dogs, bless them, seemed to be the only ones who instinctively understood the appeal, sniffing curiously at the smooth, cool surface. One tiny poodle tried to pee on it, but the sand just absorbed the liquid instantly. Car after car slowed down. Whispers carried easily across the quiet morning air. Is that sand? Why would he do that? I heard they fined him for his other plants. The most important reaction, however, was still pending. I didn't have to wait long. At precisely 10:15 a.m., as I was conducting a crucial internal monologue about the best place to put a single, symbolic garden gnome, Dolores Finch pulled up in her pristine sedan. She stopped directly opposite my house. She parked, but she didn't get out. She just sat there, staring. She was wearing a huge pair of designer sunglasses, which only heightened the drama. She slowly, deliberately, opened her car door. She didn't look at me yet. She only looked at the sand. She stepped onto the curb, and with a flourish that belonged on a bad reality TV show, slowly removed her sunglasses. Her eyes, squinting against the glare of the highly reflective silica, were wide with outrage. The shock was immediately replaced by a burning, furious indignation. She marched across the street, stopping precisely at the aluminum boundary. "Mr. Harrison!" she hissed, her voice a compressed, barely contained fury. "What is the meaning of this spectacle? This desert!" I stood up, holding my coffee mug. "Good morning, Ms. Finch. Isn't it lovely? It's compliant. Zero maintenance, zero water consumption, and entirely non-flora. I removed all the unnatural flora, as requested." "This is not compliance, Mr. Harrison. This is an act of blatant mockery." "Mockery is not a violation of Article 4, Section B, Subclause 12, I countered, genuinely enjoying myself. "Please point to the section of the bylaws that forbids pool filter media. I've even ensured the aluminum border meets the approved edging requirements." She scrambled for words, her face contorting. She had prepared for me to plant turf, or maybe put in some approved mulch. She hadn't prepared for the geological equivalent of a blank slate. The texture is offensive. It's dust. It's going to blow onto my meticulously maintained petunias." "I purchased high-grade coarse silica, Ms. Finch. It's too heavy to blow away easily. And should a few grains land on your property, I believe the proper recourse is to file a complaint against the unintentional air movement, not against the ground cover itself." "This is an abomination. It's a hazard. It's—" she sputtered, pointing a shaking finger. "It is entirely unnatural. No human being would voluntarily install a desert in suburban America." "With respect, Ms. Finch, it is the most natural thing I could find. Sand is fundamentally pulverized rock. It is an aggregate. It is ground cover. It is non-organic. And by your own admission, my plants were unnatural, so I removed all life. It's logically flawless." She looked genuinely defeated for a second, her energy draining away as she searched for a rule. Then, her eyes narrowed with a sudden, horrible realization. "The reflection, the sunlight, this white surface is causing glare. It constitutes a visual nuisance and sunlight pollution hazard. I will cite you under the General Nuisance Clause. You will receive a cease and desist today, demanding you cover this blinding, aesthetically criminal expanse." She snapped her sunglasses back on and marched back to her car, almost tripping over the curb in her haste. I just smiled, taking a sip of coffee. A visual nuisance and sunlight pollution hazard. Perfect. The battle was renewed, and I was ready for the next level of bureaucratic absurdity. Dolores was true to her word. 2 days later, I received a new, thicker envelope. This one cited the yard for excessive light reflectivity, the albedo issue, and potential safety hazard due to lack of defined ingress-egress pathway. That second one meant they wanted a stepping stone path, which was easy enough to fix with a few well-placed flagstones. The albedo rating, however, was the new frontier of nonsense. But the delivery method was the most important part. They had escalated. Around 11:02 a.m., a county car marked Code Enforcement pulled up. Following him, slightly awkwardly, was a standard black and white police cruiser. Dolores, naturally, was already across the street, watering her prize-winning rose bushes with an intensely satisfied, venomous look on her face. I walked out to the curb. My heart was thumping, but I was mentally prepared. This was the moment I got to use the hours I spent Googling property code definitions. The code enforcement officer, Carl, looked tired. He was middle-aged, wore a rumpled uniform, and held his clipboard like it weighed 20 pounds. The police officer, Jenkins, was young, maybe early 20s, and looked profoundly confused to be on a landscaping call. "Mr. Harrison," Carl began, sighing heavily. "I'm Code Enforcement Officer Carl Johnson. We have received a new complaint, now involving county jurisdiction, citing your yard for a health and safety hazard." "Good morning, Officer Johnson. What exactly is the health and safety hazard of sand? Are you worried about quicksand?" "No, sir. The primary complaint is twofold. 1. Excessive light reflectivity, or albedo, which allegedly poses a distraction hazard to drivers. 2. Lack of defined pathways, which violates the ingress/egress rules. I can remedy the pathway issue today with some stone, officer. That's a reasonable request. But let's discuss albedo. I assume you brought the required photometric equipment to measure the light output?" Carl blinked. The equipment? I have a sun chart and my eyes, sir. The yard is visibly too bright." I smiled politely. Visibly bright is not a measurable violation, officer. The violation must be quantifiable. If you cannot provide a reading from an approved photometer showing that my sand exceeds the maximum allowed albedo rating, which I've found, by the way, isn't specified anywhere in the county code, then the fine is arbitrary. Carl shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable. He looked at Dolores, who gave him a sharp, encouraging nod. He turned back to me, trying a different tack. Look, Mr. Harrison, we both know what this is. It violates the spirit of the Green Community Initiative. You were asked to remove the unnatural vegetation and replace it with something visually acceptable. You did this as a technical protest. I replaced the unnatural flora with a decorative aggregate that is non-toxic, non-invasive, and drought-resistant, Carl. I am in strict technical compliance. Furthermore, the WPBC fine was for unnatural flora. I removed all flora. I am now in compliance by omission. This is where Officer Jenkins chimed in, looking at the sand like it was an advanced trigonometry problem. Excuse me, sir, but is there any criminal element here? We were told this was a public safety issue. Is the sand blowing into the street? No, Officer Jenkins. The sand is heavy. I simply own a large quantity of sand. Is owning sand illegal in this county? No, sir, Jenkins said slowly, completely confused. But why? It looks like a giant sandbox. I call it desert chic, officer. I'm having a very dry spell, environmentally speaking. We're embracing the arid climate. Carl, the code enforcement officer, was clearly losing the argument. He looked defeated. The WPBC attorney assured us they had grounds under the General Nuisance Ordinance regarding the visual impact. And I argue that the WPBC attorney is acting in bad faith, targeting me personally for exercising my property rights within the confines of the law, and that their new albedo rule was pulled out of thin air. You, as a county official, cannot enforce a vague rule invented by a hostile HOA without measurable data. It's arbitrary, discriminatory, and frankly a waste of taxpayer money for Officer Jenkins to be standing here. Jenkins immediately straightened up, clearly not wanting to be associated with wasting tax dollars. Carl sighed, defeated. He knew I was right. His hands were tied by the need for measurable, objective data. I have to consult the county attorney, Mr. Harrison. I cannot issue a citation without concrete, measurable evidence of the alleged glare hazard. I will be in touch. He quickly retreated to his car, and Officer Jenkins followed, shooting me a silent, almost admiring look. They drove off. I turned and waved a single, triumphant but polite hand to Dolores, who was still frozen across the street, looking like a statue of pure, impotent rage. The day after the showdown with code enforcement, the situation went from local spat to viral sensation. I learned that my neighbor, Martha, the quiet elderly one who hated mowing, had posted a photo of my front yard, the blinding white expanse with the departing cop car, to a local neighborhood group on Facebook. The caption simply read, "They fined him for having plants, so he replaced them with the Sahara. HOA called the cops." It exploded. Within hours, a Reddit post of the same photo was trending nationally. My phone started ringing off the hook. I gave a brief interview to a local TV station, which showed up unannounced. The dialogue was pure, deadpan gold. Reporter: Mr. Harrison, why this dramatic choice? Is this true defiance? MC: deadpan: I'm merely acting within the bounds of the law, ma'am. I was fined for unnatural flora. I have replaced the flora with a purely inert, non-organic aggregate. This is a statement on American land use policies, sustainable zero-maintenance gardening, and frankly an homage to the Mojave School of Architecture. It is an expression of my constitutional right to aesthetic neutrality. Reporter. So it's a protest. MC. I prefer to call it hyper-compliance. I am the most compliant man in Whispering Pines. The resulting news segment, titled "The Sand Guy versus the HOA," made me an instant, bizarre local celebrity. The neighborhood, which had always prided itself on its perfect conformity, was now violently split. The haters, Dolores and her clique, organized an actual, honest-to-God protest. They stood across the street, holding signs they clearly made in a passive-aggressive crafting session. "Bring back the hydrangeas," "Stop sandsplaining," and "Our property values demand green." They looked ridiculous standing next to the most beautiful, pristine white sand field you could imagine. The fans, the rest of the neighborhood, the silently suffering majority, rallied behind me. The support was the funniest part. Martha, the sweet lady from across the street, came over and brought me a gift basket containing a tiny plastic shovel and pail, a bottle of SPF 50 sunscreen, and a 6-pack of beer. "Jake, honey," Martha whispered, leaning conspiratorially across the aluminum border. "That sand is gorgeous. I hate my mower. Just loathe it. I told Dolores if she doesn't stop, I'm going to put in purple lava rocks." "I like your style, Martha." "It's not defiance," she said, winking. "It's suburban necessity. We're tired of the tyranny of the turf." A middle-aged dad, Tom, who lived 3 streets over and was constantly yelling at his kids to stop digging holes in his lawn, came over and shook my hand. "Dude, thank you. You're a legend. I brought you this." He handed me a brightly colored, inflatable flamingo. "You need a yard ornament for the desert." I immediately planted the flamingo smack in the center of the sand. I even put up a small, tasteful wooden sign I designed myself. "Warning: desert environment. Please adjust albedo settings." Dolores, meanwhile, was not giving up. She was serving me with yet another notice via certified mail. This one focused solely on the maximum allowed albedo rating for the street, demanding I cover the sand with a darker, approved material, like brown gravel or black mulch, to reduce the glare. The absurdity had reached its peak. She had invented a sunlight pollution rule, and now she was trying to enforce it. I was ready. The media loved me. The neighbors secretly loved me, and I had the law on my side. All I needed was the final verdict. The final confrontation was scheduled not in a courtroom, but in the sterile, air-conditioned office of the county mediator, a kind man named Mr. Thompson, who specialized in resolving HOA disputes that had spiraled into existential crises. I was there with my briefcase, containing only the WPBC bylaws, the definition of aggregate, and a few printed-out photos of my yard. Dolores was there with the WPBC's actual, slightly sweaty attorney. The attorney started, rambling about the intent of the law, visual disharmony, and the subjective experience of community blight. When it was my turn, I didn't even stand up. I just leaned forward. "Mr. Thompson, my former yard was fined for unnatural flora. I removed all flora. I replaced it with a legally compliant decorative aggregate. Every single subsequent fine, the visual nuisance, the sunlight pollution, the albedo violation, was invented after my compliant replacement was installed, with the sole purpose of harassing me into planting turf. The new rule violates the constitutional principle that a law cannot be passed specifically to target an individual after the fact. It is arbitrary, unenforceable, and clearly driven by personal malice. I then presented a printed copy of the local news story featuring the inflatable flamingo. Mr. Thompson, the mediator, stared at the picture of the flamingo in the sand, then looked at the WPBC attorney, who had begun sweating profusely. The mediator leaned back and suppressed a cough that sounded suspiciously like a laugh. He didn't need to consult a law book. He needed common sense. "The WPBC fines are hereby vacated," he declared. Mr. Harrison's original fine was resolved when he removed the cited flora. All subsequent citations are deemed arbitrary and were applied in bad faith. Dolores had a spectacular, silent meltdown. Her face went white, then purple. She didn't scream or yell. She just gathered her papers with trembling hands and walked out, her back rigid with defeated fury. My final memory of her was her crisp blazer disappearing around the corner. I was free to keep the sand. I went home and sat on my porch, staring at my private, blazing white desert. I briefly considered planting a single, defiant cactus, but that would just give them an excuse. I kept the flamingo. Then, about 2 months later, I decided I was tired of being the sand guy. I put the house on the market. Thanks to the media attention, my house became a bizarre local landmark. People would drive by, point, and take pictures. I ended up selling the house above asking price to a buyer who explicitly loved the postmodern zero-water statement. They said they were going to put in a Japanese rock sculpture. As I drove away from Whispering Pines for the last time, leaving Dolores and the turf tyranny behind, I looked in my rearview mirror at the blinding white patch of sand. I learned one thing. When bureaucracy tells you your roses are unnatural, don't prune them. Just replace the entire garden with a private beach, and make sure you get a receipt for the 10 tons of sand.